Want your movies to look just like your favorite films? Then you need to master the art of lighting. You don't need to go to film school or rent expensive gear to do this yourself. In fact, I use Unreal Engine as my film school to practice and make my own blockbuster films from home. What's up, my name's Josh Tunin, and I went from a self-taught visual effects artist learning right here on YouTube to working on Hollywood visual effects on movies like Star Wars: Rise of Skywalker and Alien Covenant. And I want to share the biggest lessons I learned along the way. So today, you'll learn 3 frameworks used by the pros that will help improve your lighting and cinematography by going behind the scenes of my upcoming Alien short film. Hit subscribe down below, and let's get started. Let's start with our first framework, choosing the right color for your lights. Now, why I love working in Unreal is it's just like being on a real film set, except it's way faster to change the height of your light or move your camera in any position or any location without having to physically rig and move everything by hand. And all you need to focus on is the creative art direction behind each shot. So let's turn off all the lights in this scene and reapproach it as a cinematographer. Right now, all that's left inside of our scene is this red light. And this is a classic look. You might recognize it from The Last of Us or any scene where they're just lighting a shot from a single flare. Now, this is a good start, but it can look a little bit simple and unnatural because it's completely monochromatic. But in real life, you'll find a lot more randomness and more colors in any scene. So the obvious question is, where should we place our next lights? What's a framework that we can follow to know exactly what to do next whenever we're approaching a new shot? Well, the longer I've worked in animation, the more I like to follow the 60-30-10 rule. Rather than having one color dominating our scene, we can have 3 separate colors that introduce the foreground, midground, and background and create a lot more depth and complexity to our shot. Let's take a look at how to apply it. When working on Across the Spider-Verse, the #1 lesson I took away is that you want to separate your characters from the background and pop one out from the other. Right now, because everything's red, our background and our character start to merge together, and his arm doesn't pop out from the background, especially in these dark areas like on his arm or next to his helmet. This is where the 60-30-10 rule comes into place. How it works is 60% of our image, or the background of our image, should be a separate color than the foreground. So rather than having one color, red, dominate our entire image, let's find another color we can use in the background to separate our character from the rest of the film set. So I started adding yellow lights into the background, and this creates some nice color contrast to separate our character. So with our background color set to yellow, taking up 60% of our image, you might think we want red to be our 30%. But the way I like to think of this is our 30% is the neutral light on our character. Right now, because there's so much red light contaminating our image, it looks like the skin tone of our character is literally red. Now, if this was the color green or the color blue, that color would wash over our skin tones, and we still have this monochromatic look that feels artificial. So the next thing I always do is try to ask, are there any practical light sources inside of the shot that could help justify a neutral light? This might be a lamp, or a torch a character is holding, but in our case, we have this electric weapon, which is this blue fluorescent light. Now, I knew I wanted to boost the lighting off of this thing, so in my outliner, I parented a blue spotlight onto this torch. And this adds some nice interactive light that's cast onto the environment. Plus now, if I move this character's hand, that light will change and interact with the scene correctly. But another important rule to remember is that whatever the brightest thing in your image is, that's where the audience is gonna look first. Now in this shot here, I want the audience to look right at our character's face, but it's actually one of the darkest areas in our entire scene. So what we could do is we could add an additional light, mimicking this blue fluorescent light that's cast onto our character's face to draw the audience's eye onto our character. And by adding in this single spotlight that illuminates our character, it brings so much more clarity, and this shot immediately starts to feel alive with just 2 or 3 more lights added into our scene. So this is the 60-30-10 rule. 60%, or our background, is the color yellow. 30% is gonna bring our eye towards our character, which is our blue fluorescent light. And even though we started with this red palette dominating our entire scene, what we're gonna use the 10% for is the accent color. And this is the 10% that can drive the extra emotion into our scene. So in our case, this lockdown mode is felt throughout our entire scene, but we still make our character feel super clear and separated from our background. The goal here is to create color contrast. If you want something to stand out in your shot, it has to be a different color than the rest of your image. And that's why we want to pick 3 different colors from our color wheel. Now, when most people think about color theory, they're either intimidated or they'll copy a rigid color palette that you can find on the internet. But I don't think it has to be that complicated. Rather than picking 3 arbitrary colors, I always start with what is the color that you can't change? Is it the color of the sky or the color of the sun? And how can we find a color on the opposite side of the color wheel that will create some nice contrast and just feel nice and balanced? In our case, our torch light is blue, and this is something we're not gonna change. Whereas the red, orange, or yellow light is something that you can scrub around inside your color wheel here in Unreal until you find the right combination. But something important to know here is you don't want every single light to have a slightly different hue and color. If you're gonna create red or yellow light like we have here, make sure you have one distinct color that every single one of your lights has. In the most recent version of Unreal, there's this nice color palette, so you can pick the exact hue and color that you've assigned to your other lights. Otherwise, you can right-click on this light color and copy it from one light, and then you can select all these other lights in your scene, and you could paste that color right here. This way, you can add additional lights to create these nice rim lights and small details on the edges of your character, but it'll feel like everything's coming from one single light source because we're using the same exact light color. Now, if you want to make your own blockbuster films yourself, I just opened up the waitlist for Unreal Filmmaking, my upcoming course where together we'll make 3 different blockbuster films step by step, along with project files, templates, and cheat sheets so you can jump right into the action and make your biggest film yet, and go from just an idea in your head to making your own Hollywood-level films. Just go to unrealforvfx.com/film or click the link in the description below. Let's get back to the video. Now, before we move on to our next shot, I want to mention one last thing about that 60% of our background color. The easiest way to make sure our entire background is combined into a single color in our palette is to add fog into your lights. This is a technique you'll find on every film set around the world. They'll flood their entire scene with fog, and we want to do the same thing inside of Unreal. To set this up, there's just 2 things you gotta do. We need to add an exponential height fog, which you can do by going to your quick Add Actors menu, then going down to Visual Effects, and add in your exponential height fog by dragging it into your scene. But make sure you only have 1 in your entire scene. The next thing you need to do is in the details of our exponential height fog is enable volumetric fog. What this will allow us to do is control the amount of fog for each light in our entire scene to get perfect creative control. So to make sure our entire background is simplified and goes into this yellow color, just add in any light using this lights drop down here and add in a point light, spotlight, or rectangle light. And then you can crank up this volumetric scattering intensity in the details right here. What this does is we can have this volumetric fog that starts to lift up our entire background. And if you have cast volumetric fog enabled, it'll even create these God rays and be occluded by the geometry in your scene, just like a real light. Then you can alt click and drag on any of these lights and we could bring one into the foreground. Now, obviously this is a bit extreme, but I'm gonna press Shift C to look through our camera. And now that this light is a lot closer, let's bring our volumetric scattering down to a value of 5 or 10. Now we have even more yellow light lifting up our background, but if we place it in the right spot, by hiding it right behind our character, we can get a ton of realistic fog surrounding our character without changing the light contamination on the character himself. If you have a spotlight, you can also rotate this into place and create more defined beams of light by adjusting the outer cone angle. So if I lower this down to a smaller value, and now I crank up my volumetric scattering intensity, I'll see this really defined cone of light, and you can see exactly where it'll contaminate based on where it's pointing at. Plus, we can take this to the next level by animating our light. All you have to do is in the details panel, let's create a keyframe for the location and rotation. And if we scrub partway through our shot and we have auto keyframe enabled, now we can move this light off to the left, and you'll see that light pan left and right like a searchlight, adding even more energy into our shot. So let's move on to our next shot and dive a little bit deeper on how to add animation to your lights, because there's so many different ways to do this, just like you can do on a real film set. If you go back and watch Alien from 1979, you can see how many different strobes and different methods they're using to add movement onto their lights. These create lens flares and have lights duck in and out of frame, and sometimes it's just having blinking lights in the background to add more life and movement into their image. So let's do the same exact thing on our film set inside of Unreal. Now in this shot here, to make sure our sequence is cohesive, we want to use the same colors in our 60-30-10 rule. Our background is filled with yellow color, and we have these nice long shadows that are creating these nice streaks in our background, as well as yellow volumetric fog that washes out the background into this nice yellow color. Then we have our 30% illuminating our character, with this light blue fluorescent light both lighting up, bouncing down, and illuminating our character's face. Then the last 10% is what makes this shot feel dangerous, with this red light flickering on and off in the background behind our character to create this nice red rim light. Now you can see without me scrubbing back and forth in my timeline or doing anything that the blue torch and the red alert light in the background are flickering on and off. So how could you recreate this look for your own scenes? Well, it's actually really simple. So to set this up, I just have a simple point light that's just out of view of the camera, and it creates that nice rim light surrounding our character. But the way I'm animating this is where things get interesting. In our details panel, I could animate this intensity lower or darker, but I have to keyframe this inside of Sequencer versus having this continuously strobe throughout our entire shot. So if I want to set it and forget it so it keeps strobing throughout our shot, all we need to do is scroll down and create a light function material. Just like you can create a material for a surface, we can create a material like this to help animate our lights. Let me close this down and we can create one from scratch. Under our light function material here, I can click on this drop down, and at the very top, you can create a brand new asset. So let's create a brand new material, and we'll call this Flicker. Then we can double click to open this up. So right now I have a regular material that you'd assign to any object. But to make this into a light function, just go down to the material domain right here, and we'll change this from a surface over to a light function. Then all of our material settings will be disabled except for our emissive color. And this is what we can use to control our light. So how can we animate that value up and down? Well, there's actually a really simple command that makes this easy. Just type in sine. We can use this to create a sine wave, just like you'd see on your graphing calculator. When we plug this node in, it'll automatically generate a value that fluctuates between a value of 1 and a value of -1. So let's plug this into our emissive color, and then to make sure this is set up correctly, we can drag from our first pin and create a time node. And then you'll see in our material preview that this is oscillating between a value of 1 and -1. But how do I know that this is a value of -1? Well, there's some really cool debug tools that are helpful to know. If you just type in debug, we can debug scalar values. And instead, let's plug this result into our emissive color. Now, if I set this to a cube, you can see the exact output of this node. And it's jumping between a value of 1 and -1. Now, working with negative values can give you some unexpected results. So you have a couple options here. If you create a saturate node, this will automatically clamp our values so you never get any negative values. But you can also see that we're kind of removing half of the random sine wave here. So what we can do to offset this is we can add a value of 1. And now we no longer have any negative values. Plus, we can multiply this by a value of 0.5. And now we get a nice smooth graph that's normalized and set between a value of 0 and 1. Now let me remove our debug setup here, and now we get a nice animation with this flickering on and off. So let's press save, and let's start to preview this inside of our scene. To make this obvious, I'm gonna add in a brand new point light right here, and then we can assign our light function material by typing in flicker. And then we get this nice on and off animation live and interactive on our film set. But this can be a little too perfect. So if you want to add more chaos and energy into this animation, let's open up our material one more time. And instead, let's just add a couple more sine waves by chaining these 3 together. Now in our material preview, you can see that we get a much more unpredictable light animation. So let's press save. And if you want to create a simple control to adjust the speed of this, we can do this by multiplying our time by another number. So we can make time appear to go faster or slower by multiplying it by a lower or higher number. So I'm just gonna right click on our B input, and we can promote this to a parameter. And then we can rename this to speed and set it to a value of 1 by default. Now we have a lot more chaos in our animation, and we have a nice speed control, so we can multiply this by a value of 0.1, and this means it'll go 10% of the speed. And now this light works just like any other light, so you can move it around to get the perfect shape and position on our character. And you can still change the intensity and color, and that animation will still work great. Another pro tip is that we can use this same exact setup to create interactive blinking lights in the background, which is great for any spaceships or dashboards that you might have blinking on and off. This was a trick I saw all the time on set of Star Trek, and to set this up, we could create a simple cube that we'll use as our little blinking light far into the background. Then I'll press Control Space to open up my content browser so we can make a brand new material, and we'll call this Blinking Light. Then we can open this up, and let's copy the same exact nodes we used to set up our flickering light function, and now we can paste it onto another material set to a surface material. We'll still plug this into the emissive color, and I'm gonna set our base color to black. Plus, let's add in one more multiply right here so we can also adjust the color. So I'll press the V key and click in our material graph to create a new vector parameter, and we'll call this light color. Now, right now, this color is set to a value of 0. But something really cool about Unreal is we could pass this light color into our material. If I double click on this light color, I can see that this is just a vector or RGB values, and we could copy these into our material. So our red channel is set to a value of 1, green is set to 0.791, and blue is set to 0. Let me just copy the green channel here, and then we'll go back to our blinking light material, and let's set the RGB values to the same exact setting as our light. Now we have this yellow light, which will perfectly match the emissive color of our light, and let's save this. And finally, we can apply this to our cube. And now you can see that it gets darker and brighter at the same exact speed as our interactive light. So to keep this subtle, I don't want this giant cube right next to our character, but we can move it deeper into the background and have it somewhere intersecting with our ceiling, like it's this tiny LED light far into the background. And just like that, we have this nice interactive light, which matches perfectly to this real light that's cast onto our environment and our characters. And you can easily Alt, click, and drag to duplicate this around to create more of a light grid, which you might see on a dashboard or something like that. So that's the easy way to set up animatable lights anywhere in your environment. And to add several into your scene, like adding a separate one for our light torch right here, all we need to do is go back into our original flicker material, and we can add one more parameter in here. Let's just drag off of this time pin right here and create a new add node. And then we can create a simple offset by promoting this to a new parameter. And we'll call this time offset. Now we can make a bunch of new material instances for each light inside of our scene and add a simple offset to our time, which will give us a separate animation curve for each instance of our material. Now, the last lesson here is if you want to really match your lights to what happens on a real film set, is you need to change the size of your light. By default, every light you drag into Unreal is this tiny little point light. But if you look at the B-roll behind your favorite movies, you'll see that oftentimes they'll set up these massive pieces of cloth and diffusion, which create a much softer light source, rather than these tiny little points you'll find in Unreal. So to show you how this works, I'm gonna take our key light right here, and let's remove our flickering light by just resetting our light function material here. And let's start to visualize our light in 3D space. I can quickly change this tiny source light into a light tube or a light frame by adjusting the source radius and source length. Let's adjust this source length here, and you'll see this yellow line stretch out of our light. Now, if I also increase the source radius, you can see exactly what's happening here, that our point light is being stretched into a physical 3D shape. These will create bigger reflections. And another pro tip here is you can Alt and middle mouse button to offset your pivot point. Now, if I switch to rotation mode, I can rotate this light around the center of our character. And this is how you can sculpt in these really refined rim lights surrounding your character and get all these fine details that scrape along the edge of all of these surfaces. Again, you can just switch to transform mode and then Alt middle mouse button drag closer to your character. And now you can rotate this around your character through the lens of your camera. And this is my favorite way to sculpt light inside of 3D, because it's so much faster than you could ever do even on a real film set. And we can quickly try out ideas and see that, oh yeah, when we're front lighting our characters, it really flattens out our entire image, but we can scoop this around the edge of our image to create more dramatic rim lights. Now, typically, whenever I'm creating a key light for a character's face, I don't always like to use point lights and spotlights. I'll usually save my rectangle light to create a softer look on my character's face. Because this rectangle light has a bigger surface area, it'll create a softer light and softer shadows. And this is the same effect you'll get when you have these huge diffusion panels or sky panels, which is just a different light fixture you'll find on most film sets. If I rotate this around, you'll see that I get a nice soft gradient in the shadows as it comes across our character's face. Plus, we can make sure that that light is focused on our character and not contaminating our background by adjusting these barn doors around the edge of our light. I'm gonna set our barn door angle to a value of 0, and you can actually see that light get focused on our subject as we lower that barn door angle. We can continue rotating this as well and extend the barn doors so they go further on, and that way they don't affect your background. And just like that, we can make sure that our character is the brightest thing and comes forward from our image, and this way our background stays hazy and flat so the two are separated from one another. So try using the 60-30-10 rule on your next shot and use material functions to add more randomness and strobe lights into your scene to create a more interactive and crazy film set. On this last shot where this face hugger crashes down onto the floor and breaks out of his pod, we went even crazier and I added even more strobe lights into the background, and each individual light has a different frequency and timing to it, which adds a lot more randomness and energy into every moment. But you'll notice the entire sequence is gonna follow the same 60-30-10 pattern so that each shot strings together when we render it out and add it into our final timeline. So if you learned something new, press subscribe down below and go to unrealforvfx.com/film to join the waitlist for Unreal Filmmaking, where you'll go behind the scenes and make 3 blockbuster movies yourself, jamming 4 years of film school into 30-minute lessons, and I'll share all the Hollywood visual effects secrets I've learned over the last 10 years in the industry. And if you sign up now, you'll unlock some awesome bonus project files ahead of time. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.